There is a particular kind of horror that history tends to bury, not because it is too small to matter, but because it is too large to fully absorb. It lives in the space between strategy and atrocity, between military decision and human catastrophe. And if you have never heard of what the German Wehrmacht did during its retreat across Eastern Europe, then what you are about to learn will change how you understand this war and what men are capable of when the mechanisms of civilization are stripped away. This is not the story of a glorious final stand. It is not the story of honorable soldiers fighting to the last. This is the story of an army that knew it was losing and chose, in that knowledge, to destroy everything behind it. Villages, bridges, crops, livestock, and people. Especially people. Sit with me for a moment, because before we talk about strategy, before we talk about military doctrine and the logic of scorched earth, I need you to understand something fundamental. Every number in this story was once a human being. Every burned village had children who played in its streets the week before. Every mass grave was filled with people who had names and families and plans for the future. Now, let's go back to the autumn of 1943, and to a German army that was beginning to understand, for the first time, that it would not win this war. By the summer of 1943, the illusion was gone. Stalingrad had already happened. Die Siegsarmee, once the pride of the a force of more than 300,000 men, had been encircled, starved, and obliterated on the frozen banks of the Volga River. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus had surrendered in February, walking into Soviet captivity with what remained of his command. The propaganda machine in Berlin had done its best to spin the catastrophe into a tale of heroic sacrifice, but the soldiers on the Eastern Front knew the truth. They had seen it with their own eyes. Then came Kursk in July 1943. The largest tank battle in the history of warfare. Germany had staked its last major strategic reserve on a massive armored offensive, Operation Citadel, designed to pinch off a Soviet salient and restore momentum to a stalling campaign. It failed. It failed, not with a whimper, but with the grinding destruction of hundreds of tanks, thousands of men, and the last realistic hope that Germany could dictate the terms of this war. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht was no longer capable of sustained offensive operations on the Eastern Front. What followed was not a controlled withdrawal. It was not a planned repositioning. It was a fighting retreat, brutal, desperate, and increasingly chaotic, stretching across thousands of miles of Soviet and Eastern European territory, all the way back toward Germany itself. And as the German army retreated, it carried with it an order that would transform its withdrawal into one of the longest sustained episodes of deliberate mass destruction in the history of modern warfare. Adolf Hitler's directive was issued in the late summer of 1943 as Soviet forces pushed west following the Kursk disaster. It was, in the coldest military language imaginable, a command for total devastation. The territory being abandoned was to be rendered useless to the enemy, not just militarily useless, economically, agriculturally, industrially, humanly useless. Every bridge was to be demolished, every railway line torn up or destroyed, every factory disabled, every warehouse burned, every food store eliminated. Every piece of machinery that could not be carried west was to be smashed beyond repair. And then there was the question of the people. In the military logic of scorched earth, a civilian population left behind is a resource for the enemy, a labor force, a source of intelligence, a foundation for reconstruction. Hitler's directive, and the policies that grew from it, treated the civilian population of the retreating zone accordingly. In some areas, mass executions were carried out before withdrawal. In others, the population was forcibly deported west, used as slave labor in German factories and farms. In still others, villages were simply burned, with their inhabitants left to survive as best they could in the ruins of what had once been their homes. The German military had a word for this. They called it the Verwüstung Zone, the zone of devastation. It stretched for hundreds of kilometers behind every retreating German line. And within it, the distinction between military action and war crime had ceased to exist. To understand what the Scorched Earth Retreat actually meant for the people living through it, you need to come down from the level of directives and strategy and look at what was happening in individual villages, in individual fields, on individual roads. In Ukraine, a territory that had already suffered more than almost any other region of Europe, the German retreat was experienced as a second catastrophe following the horror of the initial occupation. Villages that had survived 3 years of brutal occupation now faced systematic destruction in the final weeks before. German withdrawal, advanced detachments, small units sent ahead of the main retreat, would enter a village, gather the population, and begin a methodical process of elimination. Livestock was slaughtered or driven west. Grain stores were burned, wells were poisoned or contaminated. Agricultural equipment was destroyed, houses were set on fire, often with their contents still inside. The men of military age, anyone who could potentially join Soviet partisan forces or the reconstituted Red Army, faced a particular danger. Executions were common. Mass graves were dug in fields and forests throughout the region, filled with the bodies of men whose only crime was that they lived in the wrong place at the moment of German withdrawal. In Belarus, the situation was even more extreme. The partisan war in Belarus had been particularly fierce. Soviet guerrilla fighters had tied down significant German resources throughout the occupation, and the German response had been one of extraordinary violence. By the time the Wehrmacht was retreating westward through Belarus in entire districts had been subjected to anti-partisan sweeps that were, in practice, campaigns of mass murder against the civilian population. The village of Cotton burned in March 1943, with 149 of its inhabitants killed, including 75 children, became the most remembered symbol of what happened to thousands of communities across this landscape. But Cotton was not unique. It was one of more than 600 Belarusian villages that were destroyed, many of them with their populations inside. 600 villages. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 600 communities, each with its own streets and churches and schools and families. Gone. In September 1943, the German retreat reached the Dnieper River, one of the great natural barriers of Eastern Europe, a river stretching 2,200 kilometers from the forests of Russia to the Black Sea. Hitler had declared Etostwall, the Eastern Wall, a defensive line that would hold the Soviet advance and stabilize the front. It did not hold. The Soviets crossed the Dnieper in multiple locations, often under fire, on improvised rafts and pontoon bridges, in one of the most remarkable series of river crossing operations in the history of warfare. More than 40 crossing points were established. The casualties were immense on both sides. Soviet soldiers drowned in the river, were cut down by German fire on the opposite bank, were killed in the brutal fighting for the bridgeheads they managed to establish. But they crossed. And having crossed, they began the grinding, costly process of expanding their bridgeheads and pushing the Germans further west. For the German soldiers defending the Dnieper line, these were weeks of almost indescribable stress. Outnumbered, undersupplied, exhausted from months of constant fighting, they were holding defensive positions against an enemy whose material superiority was becoming more overwhelming with every passing month. American Lend-Lease equipment was flowing into Soviet hands: trucks, jeeps, communications equipment, food, transforming the Red Army's logistics and operational capability. The soldiers who held those defensive lines were not all monsters. Many of them were conscripts, young men sent to the Eastern Front by a regime they had little power to resist, fighting a war whose ideological character they may not have fully understood or endorsed. Their individual experiences, the cold, the fear, the exhaustion, the loss of comrades, were real human suffering, even if they were fighting in the service of an irredeemably criminal cause. This is one of the most difficult moral complexities of the Second World War, and I do not want to paper over it. It is possible to acknowledge the humanity of individual soldiers without excusing the policies of the army they served, or the crimes committed in its name. Both things are true simultaneously. War does this to human beings. It creates situations where ordinary people become participants in extraordinary evil, not always by choice, and not always with full understanding of what they are part of. But the crimes were real. The burned villages were real. The mass graves were real. The 600 communities destroyed in Belarus were real, and behind each one of those facts was a decision made by officers and commanders who understood exactly what they were ordering. If the German retreat of 1943 was a fighting withdrawal, what happened in the summer of 1944 was something closer to a catastrophe without historical parallel. Operation Bagration, named by the Soviets after a Georgian prince who had died fighting Napoleon's invasion more than a century before, was the largest Soviet offensive of the entire war, and arguably the most devastating single military operation of any theater in the Second World War. Launched on June 23, 1944, deliberately timed to coincide with the 3rd anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. Bagration, Army Group Center, the central pillar of the German defensive line in the east. Soviet planning had been meticulous, patient, and brilliantly deceptive. German intelligence had been convinced that the main Soviet summer offensive would come in the south, toward Ukraine. Instead, the blow fell in the center, with a force that the Germans were wholly unprepared to absorb. Within days, Army Group Center had been shattered, not bent, not pushed back, not forced to retreat in good order, shattered. 3 entire German armies were surrounded and destroyed. More than 300,000 German soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in a matter of weeks, a loss comparable to Stalingrad, sustained in far less time. The scale of the Soviet advance was staggering. In 10 weeks, the Red Army advanced more than 600 kilometers westward, liberating most of Belarus, large portions of eastern Poland, and reaching the outskirts of Warsaw itself. It was, in purely military terms, one of the most complete and devastating defeats suffered by any army in the 20th century. And as Army Group Center collapsed, the scorched earth destruction continued behind the retreating German units, now no longer an organized policy, but a desperate reflex, carried out by units that were themselves disintegrating, in territory that was being overrun so quickly that the destruction could not always be completed. In some ways, the collapse of German organizational capacity was the only thing that limited the scale of the devastation in the summer of 1944. There was no longer time, in the chaos of the Bagration rout, to systematically destroy everything. The army was running too fast to burn everything behind it. When the Soviet armies finally swept through the territories that the Germans had occupied and were now abandoning, they found landscapes of extraordinary destruction and survivors whose stories were almost impossible to comprehend. In Ukraine, millions of people had been subjected to the systematic extraction of food and labor that had characterized German occupation policy from the beginning. The famine deliberately engineered by the occupation authorities, the withholding of food from urban populations, the seizure of agricultural production for shipment to Germany had killed hundreds of thousands. Now, with the German withdrawal, the survivors emerged from hiding or returned from forced evacuation to find that their homes, their villages, and their livelihoods had been systematically eliminated. In Belarus, the human cost of the occupation and the scorched earth retreat was proportionally the most catastrophic of any major Soviet republic. Belarus lost approximately a quarter of its entire pre-war population during the German occupation, killed in mass executions. Dead from starvation and disease, worked to death in German labor camps, or simply swept away in the violence of a war that treated civilian life as irrelevant. A quarter of the entire population. Let me put that in terms that might be easier to grasp. Imagine that you live in a country of 40 million people. Then imagine that 10 million of them, your neighbors, your schoolmates, your relatives, your colleagues, are gone by the time the war ends. That is what Belarus experienced. And yet, Belarus survived. Ukraine survived. The Soviet Union survived. And in surviving, it began the long, brutal process of pushing the Wehrmacht back toward the German border and beyond. There is a profound irony at the heart of the German scorched earth strategy that is worth examining carefully, because it tells us something important about the nature of military logic and its limits. The scorched earth policy was, in purely military terms, rational. Denying resources to an advancing enemy is a legitimate strategy of warfare with a history stretching back thousands of years. Destroying infrastructure to slow an enemy's advance is a standard element of military doctrine. The logic was coherent. It failed. Anyway, and it failed for reasons that should have been predictable. The first reason is the sheer scale of Soviet resources. By 1943, the Soviet Union had relocated thousands of industrial facilities east of the Ural Mountains, beyond the reach of German forces. It was receiving enormous quantities of material support from the United States and Britain. Its manpower reserves, while deeply damaged by years of catastrophic losses, remained vast. The destruction of Ukrainian agriculture and Belarusian industry could slow Soviet operations, but it could not stop them. The Soviets could absorb the loss and continue fighting. The second reason is that the scorched earth policy, far from weakening Soviet resistance, intensified it. In the territories affected by German occupation and withdrawal, the experience of systematic destruction transformed ambivalence into implacable hostility. There were Ukrainians and Belarusians who, in the early days of the German invasion, had greeted the Wehrmacht as liberators from Soviet rule. The German treatment of the civilian population, the mass murders, the slave labor deportations, the deliberate starvation policies, and now the scorched earth destruction eliminated any possibility of collaboration or neutrality. Every burned village was a recruitment poster for the Soviet partisan movement. Every mass grave was a reason to fight. The third reason is perhaps the most fundamental. The German army, by 1943 and 1944, was not losing because of a lack of strategic cleverness. It was losing because it had started a war it could not win, against opponents whose combined resources and determination dwarfed its own. No degree of tactical or operational skill, and the Wehrmacht had genuine tactical skill in abundance, could compensate for the fundamental strategic miscalculation of June 22, 1941. Germany had chosen to invade the Soviet Union. In making that choice, it had set in motion a chain of events that no amount of scorched earth destruction could reverse. The burned villages did not save the Wehrmacht. They simply added one more layer of devastation to a landscape that was already soaked in suffering. It would be convenient to reduce all of this to a story about Hitler, to locate the source of the scorched earth atrocities in the pathological mind of one man, and use that to spare everyone else from scrutiny. But history does not work that way, and the evidence does not support that convenient narrative. The scorched earth orders were issued by Hitler, yes, but they were implemented by generals, by colonels, by majors and captains and lieutenants, by professional military officers who had taken oaths, who had received military educations, who understood the laws of war, and who chose to carry out these orders anyway. Some of them later claimed, in tear post-war memoirs and in front of Allied tribunals, that they had been following orders under threat of their own execution. The historical evidence suggests that this defense was, in most cases, exaggerated or fabricated. The reality was that the German officer corps was deeply complicit in the criminal policies of the Nazi regime, not merely as bystanders or reluctant executors, but as active participants who brought their professional skills to bear in service of those policies. Field Marshal Heinrich von Manstein, one of the most operationally gifted commanders in the history of German military thought, oversaw the implementation of scorched earth policies in the areas under his command. He later wrote memoirs presenting himself as a professional soldier who had struggled to maintain military honor amid the chaos of Nazi policy. The historical record tells a more complicated story. This matters not as a historical curiosity, but as a moral lesson. Institutions, armies, corporations, governments, bureaucracies of all kinds are capable of carrying out terrible things when the individuals within them subordinate their personal moral judgment to institutional loyalty and the obedience of command. The German officer corps was not composed of uniquely evil men. It was composed of men who made choices. Choices that led to the burning of 600 Belarusian villages and the deaths of millions of civilians. Understanding how ordinary men made those choices is not the same as excusing them. It is the necessary prerequisite for preventing similar choices in the future. The territories that experienced the German scorched earth retreat carried its consequences for decades. In Ukraine, The destruction of agricultural infrastructure contributed to the severe food shortages of the immediate post-war years. Reconstruction was a grinding, years-long process carried out by populations that had already been pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. In Belarus, the demographic wound inflicted by the war, the loss of a quarter of the population, shaped the country's social and economic development for generations. Belarus had fewer young men of working age in the post-war period than any comparable society. The villages that were never rebuilt remained empty. The children who were never born because their potential parents had been killed left a gap in the population. That took decades to begin filling. In Germany, the reckoning was slow and incomplete. The immediate post-war years saw the Nuremberg trials, which established critical legal precedents around crimes against humanity and war crimes. But many of the officers responsible for implementing scorched earth policies, men who had signed the orders, commanded the units, and carried out the executions, returned to civilian life without facing any legal consequences. Some of them became respected figures in the new West German state. Some of them wrote memoirs in which they cast themselves as honorable soldiers. The survivors of the burned villages generally did not get to write memoirs. They got to rebuild their lives in the ruins. Before I give you my closing thoughts, I want to ask you something. If this story is reaching you, if it has made you reconsider something you thought you understood about this war, share it. Not for the numbers, but because the Eastern Front remains one of the least understood chapters of the Second World War in the English-speaking world. The people who lived through it deserve more than silence. The burned villages of Belarus deserve to be known by name, not buried in statistics. If you know someone who carries an interest in this history, send this to them. That act costs you nothing, and it means more than you might think. You may be wondering, at this point, why any of this matters to you. Separated from these events by 8 decades and by an ocean of historical distance, I will tell you why it matters to me. And you can judge whether the same reasoning applies to your own life. It matters because the decisions that led to those burned villages were not made by monsters from another species. They were made by human beings. Educated, intelligent, professionally trained human beings who had grown up in ordinary societies, who had ordinary families, who had ordinary ambitions, and those human beings, under the right circumstances, in the right institutional environment, made decisions that resulted in the deaths of millions of people. That is not a comfortable fact. It is not a fact that allows us to draw a clean line between the people who committed those acts and ourselves. It is a fact that demands ongoing vigilance about the nature of power, about the capacity of institutions to corrupt individual moral judgment, about the importance of maintaining the ability to say no, even when saying no carries a cost. The Second World War is not simply a historical event that ended in 1945. Its moral lessons are living lessons. The mechanisms that produced the scorched earth retreat, dehumanization of the enemy, subordination of individual moral judgment to institutional authority, the treatment of civilian populations as means rather than ends. These mechanisms did not disappear with the fall of Berlin. They are present in varying degrees of virulence, in conflicts happening right now in places around the world. The 600 burned villages of Belarus are a monument to what happens when those mechanisms are allowed to operate without constraint. They deserve to be remembered, the people who lived in them deserve to be remembered, and the choices that led to their destruction deserve to be understood, not so that we can judge the past from the comfortable distance of the present, but so that we can recognize the same patterns when they begin to appear again. History does not end with the last battle. It ends, if it ends at all, when the last person who carries its lessons is gone. And we are not gone yet, which means the lessons are still ours to carry. Until the next one.